Hi, I'm making a short video to discuss the the historical and cultural background for Otsuka's and Butler's novels as we prepare for the week where you're going to be writing your paper. Basically, what I've done is just provided some links to sources. One gives you an outline of the timing of the novel of Kindred, and the other one's an historical timeline of African American history. You see that in 1619, the first African Americans are brought over as indentured servants, and slavery pretty much starts shortly thereafter, 1690. First slaves are brought over to New York, New Amsterdam at the time. And then there's a century of a century and a half of this. And of course, the very important date it's missing here is 1776, the founding of the United States, its independence from England. But what's curious is that when Congress, the United States was one of the last countries to ban slavery, but when it does finally ban the further importation of slaves, it's roughly around the same time that Rufus is born. So you can maybe see this as a kind of a sea change in the thinking of the nation that coincides with Rufus's existence. And those travels back and forth, 1812, 1815, 1819, 1820, 1824, culminating into 1830 and 1831. You see the jump here, but actually what's been going on is a lot of anti-slavery abolitionism. And all this culminates with William Lloyd Garrison's publication of The Liberator in 1831, and that's here in town in Boston. And there was, from that moment on, just a big push to free slaves. And so you get, the discussion of Kevin going back and being aware that this is a big deal and wanting to be a big part of that. Of course, it all culminates with the Civil War, which does not happen in our text, although Hager would have experienced it in 1861 and ending in 1865 with the emancipation of the slaves. When we get into the 20th century, we start to see the development that actually speaks a little bit more to our class in the sense that, the 1920s, we see the Harlem Renaissance with Zora Neale Hurston writing, and finally, what I learned actually doing this little project was that there was an African American woman ran for the presidency in 1971, I think. I gave you this other link. This one's pretty good. It gives you a bunch of context and background, Nat Turner's Revolt, 1831, coinciding with William Lloyd Garrison's publication of The Liberator. You get all the abolitionism largely taking place, Philadelphia and Massachusetts. But yeah, I hadn't known that in the early 1970s, an African American woman had run for president. We have the NAACP founded in 1909, so there's a major move to establish African American identity. And here's the Harlem Renaissance with our Zora Neale Hurston, sort of creating a new identity for African Americans in writing. World War II, which we'll cover with Otsuka, the major court cases leading up to the civil rights movements, and then the civil rights passing of the laws in the early 60s, and you should definitely check all this out. It's really cool. Of course, with the death of Martin Luther King and the 50th anniversary, this is something that you've probably been seeing a lot of in the last couple of weeks. But yeah, so in the early 70s, there's the assassination. 72, Shirley Chisholm runs for president. And so this is 4 years before we have Dana going back in time. So yeah, the idea, what I was thinking was just to kind of think of how Kindred works historically that way. When we cross over to, well, first of all, when we think about the paper, one of the things I've asked you to think about is that, you could be using Zora Neale Hurston's discussion as a lens to analyze Octavia Butler's Kindred or Julia Otsuka's novel When the Emperor Was Divine. And for that, what I was thinking about was that, when you look at Zora Neale Hurston's essay, it's such a strange essay. It's so clever. She starts off by saying that in fact, that I am the only Negro in the United States whose grandfather on the mother's side was not an Indian chief, which is a joke. It's not true. And so it sets the tone that we are expecting to read this sarcastically, and it is definitely satire. She is saying all of this tongue in cheek. The first sentence is a blatant fiction to call our attention that this isn't necessarily true, it's staged. And so, and a lot of you were picking up on this in those responses, that there's a kind of honesty here, but there's also a strange kind of tongue-in-cheek edge to this. And so when she says, I'm not tragically colored, and for the record, colored is no longer used, we use person of color, and so you could only really use this word if you put it in quotation marks. But when she says this, you kind of have to think about it as if she's saying it out of the side of her face. Like, she draws a picture of somebody who's completely okay with discrimination because it gives her the edge to become a better human being. And I think on some level she means it, but she also means it sarcastically. And so she just paints a picture of just how much day in, day out she's constantly reminded of racism and of people telling her her place. And then she imagines the other side, like, she says, it must be terrible for white people to have to deal with, not being able to dance well and not being able to hold a groove. And it's funny, but I think, it's sarcastic and it's satirical. It calls our attention to the ridiculousness of discrimination. And, and she goes full blossom here and just says, like, how could anybody deny the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me, right? So you can see she's joking. But more importantly, what I'm thinking is that there's a sense in this article of, like I asked you to write about complicity, and of trying to make sense of discrimination and willing to compromise on some level about what discrimination means. Is it useful at all? And so when we go back and we think of the way that the novel of Kindred actually works with the larger discussion of slavery, one of the things that Dana recognizes is that for Tom Whalen, it's a business, and she's somewhat pragmatic about that, and I think Kevin is too, although she's shocked by it. But by the end of the novel, Dana starts understanding Tom Whalen in a way that Zora Neale Hurston starts understanding or represents herself as understanding discrimination, which I think is somewhat problematic. It makes us wonder to what extent Alice isn't right when she calls her a white and it's not that Dana is wrong. It's that the novel opens up a space to say, like, well, how much complicity is happening here? Okay, so that's definitely something to consider. The other thing, when we get to Julia Otsuka, and I've also posted a timeline here for this. And just a couple of things, right? The big issue is obviously immigration of Asian American people all throughout the 19th century. And so I've given you this timeline to consider. And what I really want you to notice is that, um, we have this anti-Asian sentiment brewing all the way through all of the immigration. Of course, the finding of gold in California makes a massive explosion of Chinese immigrants, and then there's the Chinese building of the railroads, which is very famous. But by the 1870s, 1880s, we are just making a lot of laws that are saying, Asian Americans can't own land. They can't because it's about money. So just like with slavery, it's about money, and it's about who controls the money. And so all of these laws, right, making a segregated school and everything, it's happening simultaneously while the Japanese and Chinese immigrants are creating trade unions, and they're creating a real name for themselves economically, right? Where was it? It was like 1889. They start the Shoemakers League, right? So there's like this, and also they're owning land. And so when we get to the family in Julie Otsuka's When the Emperor Was Divine, we have a precedent here of a lot of establishment. They've become middle class. They have money, etc. So I posted this PowerPoint, which I've used before, and I think about this novel in terms of acculturation, which means when one group takes on the attributes of a dominant group. And this could be forced, where a group is told you can't speak Spanish, you have to speak English. Or it could be that a group just recognizes this is the right thing. I mean, this is the way to gain power. And this is what Zora Neale Hurston says, right? I understand that power is a particular, it looks a particular way. So I'm going to act and be that particular way in order to have power. And so we get that discussion of acculturation. And for the kids, the second generation will always, lose the ability to speak the native tongue, etc. And it's this represented in Otsuka's novel with like the onslaught of American culture, right? I forget what these shoes are called, but oh god, what were those called? But yeah, you have all these references to popular American culture. And really, this is part of what makes the family so American, right? That they have adopted so much of America. But we've, of course, got the emperor creeping in the background. They don't actually have a picture of the emperor in their house. All of these objects get referenced in the first parts of the book. She's talking about some paintings that she's got up. One of them is the Gleaners. And you can see it's a French painting of slaves at work. She's got a picture of Christ, Princess Elizabeth. And I throw this in because just like with Zora Neale Hurston being sarcastic, Banksy comes around and takes the Gleaners and does the sarcastic, like if you have this picture up in your house, why do you have this up? Are you celebrating that there are slaves in this field? I get that you're into the color and stuff, but really it's not. It's like, and the mother says this, why do I have these pictures up in my house? How did I get to a point where I have objects around me that I don't even know what they're for? So you should definitely check this out. She realizes that a lot of the objects that she has around her are representative of cultural domination and imperialism, right? So Don't Fence Me In is actually a kind of folk song that's anti-government. And Gollywog's Cakewalk is a celebration of African Americans being made to do this cakewalk. And so she doesn't even recognize that she has all this stuff up. Of course, there's the tyranny of advertisements. And the little boy really deals with this a lot. So I've given you some questions to consider as you look at these. And then my last minute, the novel takes up and I've given you a lot about the Exclusion Acts and the history of how, they kept trying to keep the land, trying to keep possessions, right, marriage, etc. But it all culminates with Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 96 that basically sets the encampment, the move of Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to these camps. And so I've given you that entire thing. It's called number 19 in the book, but it's clearly Executive Order 9066. Okay, good luck with the paper.